Yes. All right. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Very good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to the students attending this class online. We continue in this very profound and largest chapter of Upadesha Sahasri, chapter 18. And to set the context for today's discussion, it's very easy, natural even, to attribute consciousness to the mind. Without thinking about it, of course, the mind is a conscious thing. And that's a highly problematic conclusion. And the example we gave in last week's class is if you look into the mirror, actually suppose you're holding the mirror in such a way that somebody else is seeing it. Suppose they can't see you, but they only see your reflection in the mirror, and you're talking to them. Any problem? No, they'll have a whole conversation with an image of you appearing in the mirror, and they attribute to that image a conscious being. Failing, if they didn't, would they talk to it? Of course, yes, of course. They know that you're standing to the side of, come on, we're intelligent people, but this is a metaphor. You get the point of the metaphor, and that is that talking head, as it were, in the mirror, certainly appears to be a conscious being to the person who's observing, and it's a completely wrong conclusion. In the same way, we reflect on our... I shouldn't use that word, should I? It really causes confusion. When we consider our own experience, there are several ways to interpret that experience. Certainly, it's possible to interpret this experience that the mind is a conscious thing. But what we do in Advaita Vedanta, and this is what's I think special and unique, one of the many things special and unique about Advaita Vedanta is our analysis of this very ordinary experience. Hidden in this ordinary experience is something extraordinary. But in order to discover that, it takes some work. Excuse me. In particular, it takes Shravana, Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. That's going to be part of our theme for today. To interpret this experience, to reveal what's hidden, and to reveal what's profound about this ordinary experience, we require scriptural revelation, we require Yukti, reasoning, and we require Anubhava. And that's what we're going to see in the next series of verses, which are very nice verses. Let me remember for change to turn this on. Okay, let's continue. Chittam chetanamityetata, chittam chetanamityetach, chastra yukti vivarjitam, chastra yukti vivarjitam, dehasyapi prasangasyat, dehasyapi prasangasyat, chakshurades-tataiva-cha, chakshurades-tataiva-cha. Chittam chetanam iti. Iti, this notion that chittam, the mind, is chetanam, a conscious thing. This notion that the mind itself is conscious, etat, this is shastra yukti vivarjitam. This is vivarjitam. It literally without means it's not supported by shastra or by yukti. So there's nothing in scripture to support that the mind is conscious. In fact, scripture again and again says consciousness is a fundamental reality, atma, which is completely separate from the mind and body. Scripture says that again and again. Also, it is yukti vivarjitam. It's not supported by yukti, and here's how. A fundamental distinction that we can make is between that which is conscious and that which is not. Simple? So the word chaitana is used here, and antonym would be jada. There is chaitana and there is jada, insentient, inert. So what is chaitana is chaitana. What is jada, and I think it was Mark Twain who said, never the two shall meet, or somebody said that, I don't know who. Anyway, they're completely separate entities. Now, when you say that the mind is conscious, what are you doing? You're taking that which is jada. Mind is a thing, right? In fact, it's a transient thing, like anything else in the world. Remember, our definition of real is that which doesn't come and go. Your mind comes and goes. You know, we use that in American English. We say, "Oh, you lost his mind," but not, which is a figurative expression. But in fact, you lose your mind every night in dreamless sleep. So the mind is clearly not a fundamental reality. It's a thing in the world that comes and goes like anything else, and that makes it so different than consciousness, which is a fundamental reality, which doesn't come and go. So this is the logic by which we can say that these two are absolutely separate and independent. So if you were to contend that the mind is a conscious thing, it is not supported by scripture, not supported by reasoning. And now there's a very common logical technique called reductio ad absurdum to reduce. I'm having some difficulty speaking today. That's interesting. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. A little dizzy, which makes it a little hard to talk. So far, I'm okay. We'll see if of course, even when I'm dizzy, I'm okay, so there's no issue. So it's a common technique in all philosophy and in Vedantic teachings to say, well, if that's your contention, look how ridiculous the ramifications are. And that's the style of reasoning that Sri Shankara uses here. He says, api prasangaha syat. Api, if you accept the contention that the mind is a conscious thing, then prasangaha syat, then this would be the outcome. What would be the outcome? That chakshara dehi tathaiva cha. That consciousness would chakshara dehi belong to your senses. Chakshus is eyes, but stands for all five senses. Adi, etc. So then your senses, etc. would be conscious things as well. So if you say your mind is conscious because it bears the marks of sentiency. By this word, Vasanti keeps telling me that no one knows what sentiency means. I don't think that's true, but it's kind of a fancy philosophical word. It really refers to the ability to perceive. That's the root meaning of to be sentient is to be a perceiver. So the mind is definitely sentient. It perceives everything that happens in your mind and outside. What about the senses? They're sentient also. But look at they're perceivers. By definition, your senses are perceivers. Pardon me for just being silly and a little bit gross. Suppose you pluck your eyeball out and put it down on the chair. Does it see? So, but that's the logic here. And that is, if the mind is a conscious thing, in theory, you could separate it from your body and it would continue to be a conscious thing. Of course, that's absurd. Similarly for the five senses. If you could somehow separate them from your body, they'd be conscious things. By the way, this hints at a modern theory. I've made many references to modern neuroscience and the philosophers who are involved in this whole mind and consciousness and brain analysis. There's a theory, it's always been there, but David Chalmers and some very well-known modern figures in the philosophy of mind have taken up what philosophers call panpsychism. Panpsychism is a philosophical theory that says that consciousness is an all-pervasive fundamental reality. Comes close to Vedanta. Consciousness is an all-pervasive conscious reality. Now, I said close. They don't. How do they account for the world? What is the relationship between consciousness and mind? What is the relationship of consciousness and matter? They get stuck real fast. In other words, it's not a complete theory. What I'm sharing with you is the essence of their theory, which sounds extremely Vedantic. But be aware that if you start to go further, their theory falls apart very quickly, unlike Vedanta, because it's unable to answer the questions, what is the relationship of this fundamental reality consciousness to the world, and how does it become manifest in the mind, etc. They can't properly, or they can't adequately answer any of that. So panpsychism, by the word psychos, I don't know the Greek word, means consciousness here. Psyche is, I think, the Greek word, and in this context it means consciousness. Pan, as I think the Greek, like Pan-American, means across. So panpsychism is a doctrine that says consciousness is everywhere. And to be everywhere, it has to be a fundamental reality. Now, what is the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is they use that to explain why the mind is conscious. Because consciousness is everywhere. It's definitely in the mind. So therefore, the mind is conscious. But this is what Shankara is pointing out. That all-pervasive consciousness is also present in your eyeball. Pluck that eyeball out, put it on the chair. Does it see? According to panpsychism, consciousness is present in that eyeball, and it should have some degree of sentiency. Panpsychism really gets into trouble when you say that consciousness is present in an atom, so therefore someone who accepts that philosophical theory has to say that an atom is a conscious being. And you can see the problems associated with that. It's a step in the right direction, in my view, because panpsychists say that it's a fundamental reality. That's a big step, a huge step. Science, by and large, does not accept consciousness as a fundamental reality. At best, they'll say it's a side effect of other things, of other complicated things. So science as a whole doesn't accept consciousness at all as a fundamental reality. Panpsychism doesn't, but it doesn't mean that panpsychism really understands consciousness as Vedanta does. Okay, next. Oh. Tadapyastvati ch18 tadapyastvati ch18 lokayatika sangatehe lokayatita sangatehe nachadhir drishyarasmiti nachadhir drishyarasmiti yadyabhaso nachetasi yadyabhaso nachetasi. So here we have a Purva Pakshi who says, an opponent, someone who has an opposing point of view. This is our style of Shankara introducing the opposing point of view. And this is the point of view of the so-called materialists. And this is, excuse me. Materialists was a school of thought, a non-Vedic, a non-orthodox school of thought in ancient times. And they say here, tad api astu iti chet. Tad api astu, let it be so. Let the senses be conscious. Let the body be conscious. So the previous verse, Shankara said that if you say that the mind is consciousness, mind is a sentient thing, then senses should be a sentient thing, the body should be a sentient thing, the chair should be a sentient thing. Maybe. I don't think the materialists would have a hard time answering that, but here's Shankara's introduction of another opposing point of view. And the materialists would say, okay, what's wrong with that? Let certainly senses seem to have consciousness. The body, set the chair aside, I shouldn't have said that. The body doesn't seem completely inert. We know it is, but at least while it's alive, it seems to be quite infused with consciousness, with sentiency. So this is a position of the lokayatikas. Lokayatika is a term that Shankara uses here, and to refer to those materialists. And he says, "Iti chet," if that is your contention, tanna. This is typical Shankara. First, you give a very short answer, then you give a more elaborate answer, and then sometimes you give an even more elaborate answer. First answer goes like this: tanna. No. And then he explains in the second half. So this is what his more elaborate answer is: lokayatika sangatehe, because this is the sangati, this is the conclusion of the lokayatikas, of these ancient materialists. So for Shankara, that's all you have to do. Is you just say, they're materialists. What do they know? Yeah, that was his perspective in ancient times. Bear in mind that the materialists were non-Vedic. They did not accept scripture as a valid pramana, as a valid means of knowledge. Some of you remember the Shadarshana. There are 6 schools of thought, including Vedanta, that accept the authority of the Vedas. But then in ancient times, there were others that did not accept the authority of the Veda. Materialists are one, Buddhists are another, the Jainas are another, etc., which is not to put anyone down. They just don't accept the validity of the Vedas. Well, to Shankara, the only way you're going to understand anything beyond the worldly realm, is you're not going to figure it out yourself. At your disposal are only two means of knowledge. You have anubhava, experience, and you have yukti, reasoning, and these are so powerful for understanding the world around us. Look what science has done over the centuries. But for going beyond worldly realities, you need something more. You need scripture. So that's why Shankara just dismisses these materialists out of hand by saying that they don't accept scripture, therefore they are lacking remember the metaphor of the three-legged table? So to use that metaphor, so the three legs of the table, Shruti, Yukti, Anubhava, you don't need a fourth, right? In fact, I pointed out before, if you have a fourth leg, the table wobbles. Think about it. A four-legged table wobbles. A three-legged table can never wobble. So there's some important teaching there. Very important teaching there. But in this context, the materialists are trying to use a two-legged table, which is not advisable. Okay, then Shankara gives one more argument to defeat this contention. By the way, I don't want to get too technical. There's a lot of logic here. So I mentioned before the panpsychists who say that consciousness is a fundamental reality that pervades the universe. When the materialists, these lokayatikas, say that the mind is conscious, they're not saying it in the same way as these panpsychists say. They don't accept that consciousness is a fundamental reality in the way that Vedanta accepts. For the materialist, consciousness would be a property. Not a reality, but a property. Like the redness of this chair, like the orangeness of this cloth. They are properties. They may or may not be there. Consciousness happens to be a property of the mind. Therefore, it is consciousness. Therefore, it is sentient. Consciousness is not a property of the chair. Therefore, it is not a conscious being. This would be the perspective of the materialists, looking upon consciousness as a property and not as a fundamental reality. It's a little bit like science. Many scientists say that consciousness, the term that they like to use, it's an emergent property. When you put a really complex thing together, composed of billions of interconnected neurons, in addition to the functioning of these interconnected neurons, in addition to that function, you can see these neurons are doing so well today, but what can I do? Anyway, bear with me. So in that brain, with all these interconnected neurons, what is the function? Signals. Information is going round and round and round. But science, not all scientists, some scientists and some philosophers would say, in that brain, there is an emergent property. That emergent property is mind and consciousness. So this is one of many scientific and philosophical theories. And Shankara rejects that. He says, nacha, that can't be the case, which means consciousness cannot be a property of the mind. That's our position right here. Consciousness cannot be a property of the mind. Nacha, why? Because then dihi, the mind, drishihi asmi iti yadi abhasaha na ch18. Starting that last part. Yadi abhasaha na ch18. If consciousness were not he summarizes the entire prior part of this discussion, if consciousness were not a fundamental reality reflected in your mind, yadi abhasaha na chetasi, chetas, mind, chetasi, in the mind. So if this fundamental reality called consciousness were not reflected in the mind, then dhihi, for that mind, drishihi asmi iti na. There could not be the thought, I am Brahman. Now this is we mentioned Shruti Yukti Anubhava. This is a little not different, but a little bit of an extension. Some people have this thought, I am Brahman. Who has that thought, I am Brahman? An enlightened person. What is the experience of the enlightened person? The experience of an enlightened person is to have the thought, I am Brahman. That's the experience of an enlightened person. And if you have that thought, I am Brahman, that validates everything that Shankara has been teaching here in what we've been calling Pratibimbavada. When the enlightened person has the thought, I am Brahman, that is a validation of Vedanta in general and Pratibimbavada in particular. And here's the point. Shruti Yukti Anubhava. Anubhava is twofold, Anubhava experience. One Anubhava is your Anubhava. Another kind of an Anubhava is called Vidvat Anubhava, the experience of an enlightened person. So when we say experience, we don't mean only your experience. Why should we limit it to your experience? What about the experience of an enlightened person who has that thought, I am Brahman, validating all of these teachings? So drawing upon Vidvat Anubhava, we then dismiss, or Shankara dismisses the possibility that consciousness is a property. And you can see how thorough Shankara is in this discussion. And that's thorough after I've chopped out so many verses. I've told you that we're taking roughly 50% of this chapter. This chapter is 233 verses long, and we're taking the liberty to shorten it by taking out certain parts. By the way, I mentioned this long ago. Allow me to mention it again. There's one comment, somebody who said that I shouldn't do that. We should take every single verse, and I wish we could. If we had another year or two, we could certainly. And you're capable of understanding. It would just mean that for topics when we're talking about things that you haven't been introduced to before, we need to have several classes of introduction before we can understand what Shankara is saying. We could definitely do that. We've chosen not to. But what I find, and what I hope you're appreciating, is that something that happens that every editor knows very well. Every editor, and many of you have done editing and you've discovered this for yourself. When you have a piece of writing, the more you can chop out without losing the meaning, the more clear and powerful it becomes. Every editor knows this. If you can say it in fewer words and maintain the complete sense, it is so much more powerful. And I find that's true in the way we're taking this chapter, by removing little bits. Can't call them detours or sidetracks, but Shankara will take something and then introduce. Shankara will introduce, for example, a Purva-paksha Siddhanta, which is not exactly a detour because he wants to do it. That's his purpose in writing this chapter. But it's not exactly the main flow of thought. It's like a loop on the side from the main flow of thought. So by chopping off these parts, as long as we don't chop off anything essential, then what remains, I think, is much more powerful. All right, let's continue. Buddhyarudham sada sarvam, buddhyarudham sada sarvam, sahankartra cha sakshinaha, sahankarta cha sakshinaha, tasmat sarvavabhasognaha, tasmat sarvavabhasognaha, kinchidapyasprishan sada, kinchidapyasprishan sada. Okay. Notice that we've skipped ahead. The prior verse was 89. Now we've skipped to 94. So, and by the way, when I do that, it's very carefully. I hope it's more like what an example, what a comparison. Compare a surgeon to a butcher. My God, I sure hope I'm more like the former, and not like. And I try, really, it's actually very time-consuming to go through this text and make those decisions, what to keep and what to chop aside. Imagine a surgeon removing a tumor from your brain. You know, the tumor tissue looks pretty much the same as the brain. It's gray, mushy. They have to figure out what is the tumor tissue and what is the brain? And they look almost identical. They have of course they have a lot of techniques, imaging techniques that they use, but they have to be that very careful. Okay, enough said. So, sarvam, everything, sada, always, buddhi arudham, arises in your mind. One of the fundamental tenets of Advaita Vedanta is the only thing you directly experience is the contents of your mind. The world outside and everything else is experienced indirectly via your senses. The only thing you experience directly is what is buddhi arudham, that which arises in your mind. But that's not the point Shankara is making here, but he's reminding you of that important Vedantic principle. So everything arises in your mind, plus one other very interesting little bit. So sarvam, everything. Everything means everything. Are you an everything? Everything, but you are not a thing. So when Shankara says everything arises in your mind, that everything excludes you. But in one sense, there is a you in your mind, an I in the mind. I did it. I know it. I see you. I feel it. I hear it. Ahankara, that sense of I-ness, is also a mental event. And Shankara very clearly says, sa ahankaratra, along with the ahankara. So notice that sarvam doesn't include everything. Sarvam leaves out you. So that's why Shankara specifically includes that ahankara, that sense of I-ness. So all of that arises in your mind, and all of it is sakshinaha. Here, sakshi is in a genitive case, the possessive case. Possessive case means the possessor. So my translation here is overly literal. I'm making an excuse for myself. It's overly literal by saying it belongs to the witness, which in retrospect is not a helpful translation. So it's literally correct, but it's just witnessed. Everything that arises in your mind is witnessed. It's unnecessary for me to say belongs to the witness. It's grammar. Interesting that grammar can get in the way of translating. You wouldn't think so, but here's evidence of it right here. Anyway, the skill of translation is quite, anyway, that's my thing. I've been doing so much translation for years and years and years. It's quite an art. I love that art. Anyway, everything that arises in your mind is known. Notice there are two eyes going on right now. Not these two eyes. But there is the I, the sense of individuality, the ahankara, which is in your mind. Then there's a second I, the real I, consciousness. So it's just, we've talked about this before. You can follow this now clearly. Imagine coming to the teachings of Vedanta for the very first time and getting into this discussion, two eyes. You'd be stuck on this. You wouldn't get anything. The point I'm making is that our discussion now is at a very sophisticated level where we're distinguishing between the true I and the masquerading I. The true I is consciousness, and the masquerading I is a mental event that says I am an individual conscious being. It's a thought. Okay, but now we can differentiate very clearly so that ahankara is one of the many things arising in the mind as opposed to the sakshi, the witness, the true I, which is pure consciousness. So, and this is clearly an explanation of your, this is something we forget, with Shruti Yukti Anubhava. This is supported by your own experience. And to me it's very surprising that scientists and philosophers kind of dismiss this experience. The experience that whatever happens in your mind is known to you, witnessed by you, observed by you. In science and philosophy, they shy away from that perspective because they claim it's subjective. Of course, whenever you're talking about I, it's subjective. But they in their effort to be objective, they throw the baby out with the bathwater and they fail to acknowledge the importance and validity of that experience. You, as pure consciousness, you indeed, at an experiential level, are the observer of whatever is present in your mind. You are the sakshi. Now, Shankara, based on that, makes a conclusion. He says, tasmat. Therefore, based on the fact that consciousness is the observer of all mental events, including the ahankara, based on that, he says that jnaha means consciousness. Consciousness is witness. Consciousness is sakshi. Or you can say sakshi. I don't. If I wanted to confuse you, some of you would get this. If I want to confuse you, I would say sakshi is consciousness. Consciousness is not sakshi. Some of you may get that. Sakshi is nothing but consciousness. You get that. But consciousness in a particular context, and only in a particular context, can be called sakshi. So, which is to say, consciousness is what it is, and witness is consciousness in a particular context. Okay, and if you didn't get that, don't worry, don't worry about it. That's not Shankara's point here. He says tasmat. Since we can easily make this distinction between observer and observed, therefore, jnaha, consciousness, which is sarva avabhasaha, which is reflected in your mind as all worldly experiences and as I-ness, ahankara. So that consciousness is reflected in your mind, but that consciousness in and of itself, kinchit api asprashan sada. Yeah, it'd be better if you put a na in there, but Shankara didn't. He used asprashan. That consciousness is asprashan, untouched, sada, always untouched. Kinchit api, at all. The consciousness, I'll paraphrase, consciousness is not affected by what arises in your mind. And the expression in Sanskrit that's usually used is na kinchit api, not even a bit. Is consciousness affected? And here we're back to yukti. This is not based on anubhava, because according to your anubhava, everything affects consciousness. If you get a headache, I have a headache. I am in pain. So everything is normally in your experience, in the experience of an unenlightened person, consciousness is subject to being affected by everything. But for one who's enlightened, that is not the conclusion at all, and that's based on yukti. Not on, let me finish with, let me make this point a little bit. It's based on yukti. Why? The sun shines. Is the sun affected by what it shines upon? You know, it's just simple logic. Observer is separate from the observed. When you see something orange, how does that orangeness affect you? The orangeness belongs to what you see. The orangeness doesn't affect you at all. So this is very, very simple logic. Now, what happens for the enlightened person? Is the enlightened person's consciousness affected? Would you? Yeah, let me just end. We'll expand this for a few minutes, and then we'll end the class, perhaps a few minutes early. It was a good question. Is the enlightened person's consciousness affected by physical and emotional pain? Before we answer that, I'll ask you a question. Think very carefully now. Is your consciousness affected by physical and emotional pain? Based on what you understand that your consciousness is unchanging. You understand that. Your consciousness is unchanging. So how can your consciousness possibly be affected by anything? You get it logically. You understand that. Yet, you seem to be affected by what happens. And that's fine. That means that there's a little bit more work to be done. But the point is, yes, there's more work to be done, but the point is, your consciousness, let me presume that you're not enlightened yet. And I make that presumption only because you came to class today. Otherwise, I don't know. Yeah, you could be. So, assuming you're unenlightened, if the consciousness and you understand that consciousness is unchanging. We've talked about that so much. I have no doubt that you get it. Consciousness as a fundamental reality is unchanging. You get it. So if the consciousness of an unenlightened person is unchanging, then what about the consciousness of an enlightened person? So you get the point. Consciousness, properly understood, is an unchanging fundamental reality and therefore is not affected by anything. The difference is one of experience and not of understanding. So the enlightened person has an unenlightened person has an experience of suffering. When pain is present in the mind, an unenlightened person will experience suffering. An enlightened person will experience the pain like anyone else, but without suffering. Pain in the absence of suffering, which we've discussed a lot, so I'm not going to elaborate at this point. But please note in that leading question, when I asked you, is your consciousness affected by physical and emotional pain? You can only answer no. There's still more to be understood, but that part you understand very well, and that is such an important part. It's a good place to conclude our class today. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.